Little and big fellows who wants to know how to draw hair. In this tutorial I will reveal some special tips after which you will never draw hair the same way that you did before. I mean sticks on the head. So come on and let's get started. There were days that hair was a most tedious thing for me to draw. I didn't like it. I used to draw individual hair and it looked, as you can see. Digital drawing wasn't any better. I was making a chaotic mess and I thought that the more hair I will draw, the better the result will be, but to no avail. The hair I drew was flat, amateurish, and look at this hairline. It's like hair put on the egg. But I redrew those drawings once again and look at my progress. Wow, it's much better now. I hope you see that. The shapes are more interesting and the whole process of creating, sketching and rendering is much different. I will show you everything in that tutorial. We will start from why we draw hair, then we will go to theory of creating hair, then we will create different kind of hair, I mean color and hairstyles, and at the end we'll go through demo, which will show you the whole process. So, starting from the beginning, why we draw hair? It's obvious that people usually have hair, but in drawing, we usually draw them to emphasize dynamism, composition, to add more volume to our drawing, or we want to add character to our characters. It sounded like a purple prose. So we add different things like braids, rubber bands, hairbands, hairpins, hats, etc. Until we dive into theory, remember to draw hair on head. I know it sounds obvious, but many tutorials propose drawing hair floating in the air, just creating random strands. It doesn't teach you to draw hair, rather render strands of hair. So make sure that you exercise by drawing them on head. So jumping directly into theory, I want to show you that hair is rather a graphic design element that you can visualize as if it was rather 2D than 3D. It doesn't demand anatomical knowledge, but rather creativity to create a good shape. I just drew some different female hairstyles from images. What I want you to really see from that time-lapse are shapes of that different pink figures. You must create them the way they must be appealing and interesting. So at this stage, don't consider her to be 3D, but rather 2D figure that you have to make look interesting. But how to make that shape interesting? I will tell you in a few minutes, but at first I want to show you the example of hair that, however, look very realistic and many people adore that kind of style. I don't recommend to draw hair like that to beginners. But if you want to effectively draw hair from imagination, it's better to learn the construction of hair based on shapes. To be honest, I don't recommend drawing hair this way at all, but this can be a matter of taste. So remember, shapes first and foremost. For example, on this drawing, you cannot see any hair, but the principle is the same. What's this principle? You must focus more on contours and introduce more variation. I was talking that you must consider hair to be rather 2D shape than 3D, but let's go further. And at this moment you are ready to see my plasticine Mulan figurine. Now you are ready to comprehend that hair are a mass, not individual hair, and you must consider this to be rather 3D. Oh my god, what's going on? You said that we have to consider hair like a 2D shape, and then you are saying that's rather 3D shape? No, at the beginning, make a contour like creating only 2D shape. That is the most important thing at the beginning. But as soon as you make that shape, think about the volume. Look how important is that shape and how it could completely reverse and change our drawing. I will draw some examples of hairstyles to my Diabline character. You can see that only some lines will do, and you don't need much to create interesting shape. I will go for this short hairstyle because I like the shape. It's very consistent with the character. It resembles a bit fire tongues and flames. This shape of hair looks quite interesting because it has a varied line on the contour. You can see some sharp and mild angles. For example, if I would draw the ponytail like that, it would be a bit boring. If you want to create a strong shape, follow this rule. This shape is good because it consists of big, medium and small shapes. If I zoom out, the big shape is the only one you can see. These aquamarine lines outline the main shapes. You have to start from them. Then yellow ones show medium shapes that you have to draw after the big ones. And at the end you can finally go to individual hair. I made them red. Remember that hair is bigger than the skull, but from time to time you encounter on some examples that has little volume. They also can have a good shape, but I prefer to stay from them away. I don't pick references where hair has little volume. For example, I will not go for this one because I can't see any interesting features in that kind of hair. The shape is blunt, dull. You don't have any big, medium and small shapes. Rather a big sheet of hair. There is no variation in case of contour or even color. I can't see shadows that hair could cast on her face. The reflection is not very clear and there are no layers there, so blah. We go for something else. When it comes to the way of sketching hair itself, you don't have to connect every line. You can draw dynamically from your arm or from your wrist if need be, creating rapid movements that are more likely to create flowy lines. Okay, it's time for some practice. We will go through many different kind of hairstyles, starting from wavy hair, because they are base for other types of hair. On the left, I gathered some references with different hair arrangement at the parting. This one creates a slight overturning at the left side and no overturning on the right side. And this example creates a bigger overturning on the left side, and this one no overturning. Her hair is heavy, so it flows on her arms and head. So basing on these references, I'll try to create flowy hair. I start from the parting. I will lift her left part of hair slightly, and I won't do it on the other side. Then I will create a very simple outline and general shape of her. I want to know when they end in space, so I take care of the contour. At this stage, I try to imagine which kind of strands are in front of and which are behind. That's a very important tip. You want to avoid parallel lines on the hair next to each other. You don't want to create such kind of thing, but rather different kind of angles and lines on a specific strand of hair. Okay, we've got the simple sketch, so we can go further to coloring. The sketch doesn't have to be complicated, just to have to be clear. You have to recognize each strand of hair. Okay, now we can add some base color. I will do it with lasso tool, and you can do it other way. If you're using Procreate, you can do it with a big brush. I will add more color on the rest of the drawing because I want it to seem coherent. Before we move on to simple shadows and gradients, I want to show you this drawing because you can see some simple examples on it. Please note the dark roof of the hair of Shakira and simple layers that are highlighted minimally on each drawing. We will try to apply this minimal approach to our drawing. I select the circle gradient and I put it on the top of the hair and near to the neck because there is a lot of shadow there. With red outline, I select areas that need darker color. These are strands that are behind others. Why I gathered so many ribbons of the left? That is why hair behaves exactly like ribbons. We'll try to mimic this ribbon shape, but we have to remember that strands of hair are not exactly 2D, but we have to bulge them in the center. What the ribbons still have is the highlight. It's very similar to the highlight of hair. What you can see is that this highlight is usually at the center of this bending part, and its shape resembles H letter that is curved bent in perspective. I will darken a bit these bending parts and I will try to recreate this H-shaped highlight on the strand. I prefer to do it on the layer mask and I usually change its colors, but you can do it in your own technique. I start adding this ribbon highlight shape on all of her hair as if it was a big ribbon, and I try to curve it around her head. I don't draw it flat like the example underneath. Then I add this H-shaped highlight on other strands of hair, and finally I'll try to divide this big highlight into little ones. Good drawings behave like fractals. General principles apply to large parts, medium parts, and the smaller ones. When we have highlights ready, it's now time to separate our strands by thickening the lines between them, but we don't want to thicken it on the whole length. When we have got our separation of strands ready, I will add some more loose strands, especially on the contour. That will make her more natural. You can see that we are naturally diverging from creating big shapes to little ones. I will add some more rendering on her face just to make the drawing more consistent, and first hairstyle is ready. We don't need to draw any little lines to achieve the whole hairstyle. I use the same process creating those 4 portraits of Maneskin group. Okay, now we move on quickly to fringe and braids. I'll start to make this kind of hairstyle from the parting, of course, or rather a point from which I start drawing the fringe. I try to vary the line of the fringe. I cut some triangular shapes in it, and I try to avoid full fringes without that triangular cuts. Take note, I create a little hollow near her parting, and then I go directly into creating braids. At the beginning, I create a big shape just to know where the braid starts and where the braid ends. I just want to know where I should sketch the braid into. I always start from one side. I usually prefer the right one. I create some curved lines that converge inwards, and then I try to recreate the other side. If you would like to create a braid with pre-sketch, I will make parallel lines with the line in the center, and then some oval-like shapes on the right side, and then the same shapes on the left which converge at the right angles to those on the right. Some math basis is needed there. I reduce opacity of the pre-sketch and I create flowy shapes that are similar to the base. I don't put much attention to make these braids properly and correctly made, but I rather focus on the flow and dynamism of hair. So in my opinion, it's better to make a flowy braid rather than a proper but stiff one. Now I'm creating blonde hair, but nonetheless I will choose some brown color and I will add it at the same places I did before, so near the parting and under the ears. I will use both gradient and more hard shadows. I would also darken the ends of the fringe in order to make it more convex. Now it's time to add some highlights in this H shape. If you are skilled, this takes a short time to add them. I would also introduce some highlights on the braid, also in H shape. They are too light, too excessive, so I will reduce opacity a little. That is time to make more separation with dark lines, and I will give you the last tip on blonde hair. If you want them to look more naturally, put some purple colors on it, especially in shadows. I will blend this purple color a little or reduce its opacity, and at the end I will add some details. Some random strands, especially on the contour, to make them more messy, because then they will look more natural. And at the end I will add some more rendering to the rest of the figure. Two previous examples were similar to each other, but then we are going to totally different hairstyle, and the rendering and sketching would be totally different from previous ones. We start from the big shape. I try to use rather angular lines because then I could define the shape more. Notice the hairline. And then I will create some messy contour with curly short lines that are really varied. I don't care if they connect to each other because I want the contour to be natural. Alas, I have to spoil it with the base color. We don't see these beautiful contour lines, but we will fix it in a moment. I make sure that the outline of the hair is really differentiated. It means that it consists of different shapes. Finally, we can go to highlights. It's much different from the previous ones. I try to add them on the outer ridge with lighter areas of irregular frizzy shapes. Let's add some color to the rest of the character, and the third example is ready. I will just add some little desaturated blue highlights because I love them on dark skin and hair. Let's go to very short hair. We have to start from the hairline because it's the most prominent and visible thing in the whole hairstyle. It has a good potential to create dynamism. We'll start from creating a protruding, I don't know how it calls, it's like headland? Okay, so a little headland near the ear, and then we go up and we go backwards to the top of the head. This is an overall example, but the shape of the hairline could be much different from person to person. When we have our hairline ready, we will go to references, and now I will color the whole head because it would be much easier to color hair then, and I will show you why. I select whole hair and I'm using gradient to darken the top of the head, and it gradually lightens the color while it comes to the ear and neck. To emphasize it more, I select the skin color and I lighten this hairstyle from the bottom. I will get rid of the sketch line of the hairline because I want to vary this hairline shape. When it comes to short hair, it's important to show that underneath the short hair, the skin shines through. Okay, now we will vary the contour line to make it more hairy. I pay most attention to the top of the head and hair near the forehead. I also draw some loose strands. Finally, I make some blue highlights. I usually make them blue when I draw the black hair because I want to make them a little bit stylized. These highlights have irregular shape and they are very light and they are barely visible because I don't want him to look as if he had the hair gel. Yet some minor corrections in rendering and we can go to bun, but the silver one on the old man. So I start with a parting and then with irregular shape I make it irregular and rather angular than smooth because it allows me to create more defined shape. I add also some loose strands in the front to make the whole hairstyle more interesting. I start with a darker color because I want highlights to be more prominent, more visible, and they will be more visible if the base color is a little bit darker than you think. Next, I add darker shades. I'll separate strands of hair with a darker grayish color, and I add details at the end. The process is the same as before. The last example will be red medium short hair, and if you stayed to this moment, congratulations for you. And this time I will also start from darken base and I will use gradient, the same technique as with the very short hair, so lighter near the ear. When I draw short hair like that, it's important to think as if it was a 3D shape, and this time I will be rendering the face and the hair at the same time because that's the more natural way of rendering hair. It's easier to decide how much detail we should put on hair when we compare it with details on the face. At the end, I will also provide these portraits with minor details because these minor details enrich the drawing so much. It's good to leave them at the end, but surely not to start with them. It's time to sum up what we already know. The first step is to create a solid sketch containing big, medium and small shapes. Then I just pour out color. Then I add some gradients and darker shadows. Next highlights and lastly details and more rendering. At the end I will reveal some hot hair tips, but now we will go through demo of creating the whole hairstyle. I chosen the one with most challenges because you can see a bun, some loose strands, ponytail and fringe. When I look at it now, it's a lot of things to do. It seems too impossible to get through all these steps when you see the final result. So we will cut the whole process into simple steps. First, we will focus on the sketch as if it was a whole drawing. So you can even start from the sketch and come back to the drawing the next day. I start from the fringe because it creates natural parting from the rest of the hair. I create different loose strands on it with different shapes, small, medium and big ones. I also like to create some loose strands near the ear because it gives a romantic look to the whole figure. I also provide the bun with some loose strands. As you can see, the bun is not an oval, but it also has a dynamic shape. Then I separate bigger shapes into smaller ones by carving into them. I try to put some strands behind and some in front of the whole hairstyle, And at the end, I want to emphasize the volume of the whole hairstyle, and with the same brush but with the bigger size and the smaller flow, I create some simple shadows. I like this hairstyle so far, but I want to complicate the whole hairstyle because you will learn more. So I add some ponytail and loose strands. When the sketch is ready, I introduce the base color. I look for a while for best fit. I color also the loose strands, and those strands that are in the back will be lighter as if they were in the distance. The next step is a mandatory color change of the sketch lines. I never leave them black. Then I add darker color with gradients under the ear, near the top of the head, under the bun. These are soft shadows. And after that, I create more hard shadows with a hard round brush. These are shadows that strands that are in front of cast on strands that are behind. Then I try to make other strands to look more 3D. I darken them in some areas, this time with a soft brush, and on this stage hair is looking more 3D and there is ready for highlights. I start by choosing lasso tool and selecting H-shaped shapes. I do this always with lasso because it allows me to create more defined, more obvious shapes. In the meantime, I change the background color because otherwise the whole drawing looks as if it was created on a printer paper. This grayish background creates more natural look. I created H shapes of highlights with lasso tool, but now I want to render them. I want to blend some contours of highlights and separate them sometimes. And this process of blending these highlights blends also with the process of rendering hair. So now we are gradually stepping into rendering, and the rendering process might seem complicated, but in fact it's really predictable. It requires little brain capacity, so I could listen to a podcast, for example, without fear of deterioration of my drawing. I wouldn't do it, for example, for previous steps. The rendering process is just consciously adding details in strategic places. You can see this process on this example of the strand under the bun. From the 3D solid shape, I try to create more hairy shape, but it's not necessary to add all these lines that indicate hair. The more important is to add a shadow, a highlight, and lines of the contour that only resembles that hair material. Rendering process is about the detail distribution. When I add some detail on the contour, I need to add them more in the middle of the drawing, because the middle of the drawing is my focus point. I don't add the same amount of detail everywhere. Some areas are more privileged, and this focus area is usually area near face, eyes. The longer the distance from the focal point, the hair could be more blended or less detailed. I drew blue hair, but the same principles apply to different colors of hair. At the end, I introduce some post-processing. I create some color variation. I use different effects and curves and liquify. And after all these changes, I consider my hair done. And as I promised, now I will tell you some hot tips. Except for shape variation, it's nice to introduce also color variation. This hair is mainly white, but if you look closer, you could see some more colors on it. Some blues, some gray, some pink. These colors are here because hair reflects some colors of the background of the environment. Similarly, you can see some reddish and greenish tones on this white hair. This kind of approach creates more life in your hair. When you have this rim light situation, compulsory cast some rim light on hair. It creates a pleasing and detailed aesthetic to look at. Sometimes it's a good idea to use some special brushes, but I don't recommend to use it often, just in contours and in specific areas. For example, this hair was made mainly with these brushes, and you can easily download this Photoshop brush set that contains everything you need from the link in the description for free. The next tip is to blend hair into background. It creates fairy tale foggy look that I really like. And finally, remember that good looking hair are not necessarily rendered hair. This one I drew really quickly, but they have everything they need to look appealing. I hope you liked the tutorial, you learned something new despite my English. I usually create tutorials in Polish, but if you would like more English tutorials, leave thumb up to let me know. Bye!